So James Gunn's Superman is it's everything that I love about Superman. Like, I had a good feeling about this film, with James Gunn going into it, because he usually approaches, his material with a lot of heart. And, his previous DC Comics projects of, like, the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker and Creature Commandos, those have all been ensemble projects, which were kind of about, like misfits. And they had, like, they're very much like anti-heroes, but Gunn knew how to make you care about them. He made sure that those films still had heart so that you cared about these, ridiculous, misfit, tossed-aside characters. So, when he's given the chance to work on something like Superman, he makes sure that heart is beating loud and fervent and just bright. Like, it pretty much is what I would expect James Gunn to do with this material. Like, he has a lot of love for Superman, and he takes a lot of great stuff from the comics and also puts a lot of, like, his own hallmarks into it so that he can make kind of like the Superman I love, but also one that's more distinct. And especially because, like, he chose, like, such a great actor to fit the part that's more for, like, not for marquee value, but for just, like, like, okay, this guy, he's got to be Superman. He's got to, work for, like, the type of character I want to make. So he brings in, like, David Cornsweet, and he has that perfect vibe for, like, what Gunn's going for here, which is basically he wants to make Superman, by extension both Superman and Clark, this kind of dork who who fumbles around and he loves dogs. It just makes him just like that, very much a lovable dork. And I think that's like a great route to go. Like, especially, like, we've got, like, the gloom and doom Superman. We've gotten the a whole, like, putting on the act that would happen with Christopher Reeve with Richard Donner's version. And Gunn just kind of makes the character, fully realized. Like, he does the same, like, James Gunn's script, he does the same thing that he does with the Suicide Squad and Creature Commandos, is that he plops you right in to the universe. He assumes that the audience is going to be able to catch up and doesn't need, like, a slow introduction to get you used to the character, which, for Superman, you don't. Like, we all know his origin by this point. The last son of Krypton, dumped on Earth, raised by Ma and Pa Kent, goes to Metropolis. He falls in love with Lois Lane, fights Lex Luthor, gains superpowers, becomes Superman. We all know that. And if you don't know that, the film still kind of, like, parses out, like, little areas here and there where it can reveal a little bit more about, like, Superman's past and how it ties in here. But we plop right down in. Like, it's been, like, several years. Like, people are now used to superheroes. It feels like a more fully realized version. Like we're hitting the ground running. Like, literally from, like, the first scene, we just see Superman smash into the ground, like, mid-battle. It's just like we're immediately caught up. We're like, okay, what's currently happening with Superman? And we're introduced to it. We're kind of, like, eased in to what we expect. We were introduced to Lex Luthor, played by Nicholas Hoult, who is very much egotistical and greedy and focused on, defeating Superman. And he has had enough time to, study Superman and his moves that he's made these very calculative efforts to assemble these other villains alongside him, like the engineer, to take care of Superman, or at least, punch him back long enough so that Lex can execute his very, like, complex and intricate plan. So he's fascinating on that angle. But I think what immediately won me over in, like, the first act of the film is just, like, the way how they established the relationship between Clark Kent and Lois Lane, here played by Rachel Brosnahan. I think I've said Rachel Brosnahan. And I love how their dynamic, like, they established that, yes, like, yeah, like, Lois does know Clark's secret identity, and they're kind of at that stage in their relationship where they're no longer kind of, like, talking about Superman as, like, an outside person, but now just into that area where they're kind of, like, establishing more trust. And not only, like, trust, but also, like, journalistic integrity with how the two of them, like, what seems like it'll start as a date turns into more of a, like a debate about Superman's vigilantism and how much control he has over his own identity. And it's not approached in, like, a very, like, kind of like lofty talk about, like, gods and, having too much power and stuff like that. It's approached in a way that you would expect a couple to feud. Not to mention, like, it's even when they're fighting in that moment, like there's still like an adorable couple, because you watch like Superman kind of try to like fumble with his words. Like there's clearly moments where he's in the wrong, where he's talking about some of his views of the world and his politics, and Lois kind of like struggles to like keep up with him and say like, yeah, that's not quite how this works, and did you really do this? And it's like they have like great chemistry in that moment where it's just like, okay, I'm locked. I'm interested to see where this goes, because one of the bigger aspects that comes up is not just the fact that Superman is an immigrant and how that plays into how he's viewed by people like Lex and people around him, but also his view on geopolitical conflicts is brought into the equation, and it's not treated in like a stumbling way that like Batman v Superman was, where it was just like like a political strife in like a particular country was just used to enact Luthor's plans to have Superman and Batman fight each other. It's nothing that dumb. Like Luthor does actually have an end goal here that kind of makes sense. It's not the most original plan, but it is one you can understand, and it is one that is where the complexity actually leads to something, instead of just like where you're you don't care about the destination. It's all about the journey itself. Here there actually is a pretty good destination with the journey. But having like Superman take an interest in politics and how he shapes himself, I think makes him far more interesting, because they establish him not just as someone who can punch out bad guys and fight giant monsters. We know that he can do that. But the film will present us with a scene where he doesn't just have to fight a giant monster, but he has to prevent any loss of life and keep damage to a very low minimum. And just watching him, try to think that quickly and try to, basically realize that it's not enough that I have superpowers. Like, I got to do better, I think makes him such a much more endearing character about trying to think of like what's the best way to use his powers, because like we all know he could obliterate a city, obliterate a giant monster, but using them in a way to avoid just chaos and carnage and damage, that's what makes him more fascinating, especially because he actually does have some competition in this film. They established that there are other superheroes in this universe, and we establish, on this planet, they establish Guy Gardner, the Green Lantern, played by Nathan Fillion, Hawkgirl, played by Isabella Merced, and the smartest man alive, Mr. Terrific, played by Eddie Gathegi, and man, he dominates his role for just having this dry wit about him. Like, they establish him as someone who is really smart, but also just, fairly unemotional and unable to interact with other people. Like, he's not entirely unemotional, but he just gets fed up with people. So it presents this challenge of Superman trying to prove that he can not so much be better than these people, but set a better example for these other superheroes. So that so eventually, that he can become the leader of what is essentially being established here as the Justice League. Although the more I looked at it, the more I looked at like the roster that's assembled and how this team comes together, I kind of looked at the screen of like, is this Justice League International? Because it really does look like, it's not completely Justice League International, and I can't help but feel like that might be part of the reason why they shy away from using the ensemble name of Justice League, in case they want to change it at some point. But yeah, having Superman learn to work with these other superheroes and additionally consider how he is viewed by the public, instead of just brooding about his situation, but also just having this bright outlook about wanting to inject kindness into a world where it's in like fairly short supply, and that he's got to basically not just fight to like save a country from being brutalized and fight to save Metropolis from being destroyed by Lex Luthor. He's basically just got to fight with the identity that he's established, and to make it make sense for people who might be scared of his presence. Not to mention, I haven't mentioned Krypto. Krypto is probably, I love how they, there are a few ways that you could go with Krypto. I mean, we've seen him established in the film, what was it, like that Super Pets film, where he's kind of like a, fairly loyal dog who, is, nice to Superman. They kind of go the opposite route here by making Krypto more of more of an untrained and unruly dog, so he ends up, and I'm sure people have probably seen this in like the trailers and clips, but yeah, like Krypto is not all that bright. So even though like Superman kind of, relies on Krypto for some additional support and help, he can't always do that because he's still a dog, and he does fairly ridiculous and dumb dog things, which kind of actually made him more endearing as well. He actually cared a little bit more about Krypto and whether or not Superman can save him in this whole adventure. Also, I'm sure this isn't a surprise, but much like James Gunn's other films, he really does love, animals. So of course Krypto gets a lot of focus here, but also a lot of smaller animals come into the equation as well that are also safe. At one point, Superman there's a scene where like Superman is just saving people from all the chaos, and at one point he just saves a squirrel, like just one little squirrel out of nowhere, and just saves it. It's like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. It's James Gunn's style here. But the other thing I appreciate with how James Gunn makes this film work is that there are a lot of Easter eggs. Like if you have been watching shows like Peacemaker and Creature Commandos, there are some cameos in it, but they're more like Easter eggs. Like if you're worried about that, you do not have to watch those shows to appreciate this film. Like they're just kind of little Easter eggs there that are off to the side. If you know the reference, you'll find it funny. If you don't worry about it. You don't need to. Just fun little stuff like that, because most of the film kind of functions that way by highlighting a lot of cool stuff from like the comics, and of course bringing in these characters we haven't seen before on the big screen, like Mr. Terrific and Hawk Girl, and they're pretty fun. But I think I do need to address like probably the biggest flaw of the film, which is that I get the feeling that like Gunn really wants to make a big impression with Superman. And he wants to bring out all the best attributes of the character here. And to a degree, he does, but there's so much that comes out in this film, and there's so many balls juggled with so many characters and different plot lines and themes to explore with Superman, that some of it does end up getting minimized to a certain degree. Like they're minimized, but they're not like, it doesn't feel like they were like wasted potential. It just feels like, like, oh, this is cool. Can we explore it? Okay, we explored it a little bit, but not as much as I'd like to. That being said, even like the smaller characters who you think would have like not much to do, they still have their moments of charm here. In particular, I really dug how they weaved like Jimmy Olsen and Eve Tessmacher, who, if you remember the original Superman film, he was Lex Luthor's girlfriend. She is here. Both of them, they could have just felt like one-note joke characters that this film could have just like thrown away. But they actually have a lot of charm to the few scenes that they have here. The same goes for Ma and Pa Kent here, which they really stress like that kind of Kansas accent in their voice here. They do become like kind of the emotional pillar for like Superman to keep on fighting, and for inspiring him to do what he does. And I would say like I'd like to see a little bit more of them in this film, especially since it almost kind of feels like they're bookends for what feels like is a bigger theme of like nature versus nurture, which is one of the many themes that Gunn has in this film. That it kind of reduces the effects of Clark's parents down to this one like little monologue about choice from Pa Kent. And I would say that's a little, like too simplified. Like, okay, we can kind of see this coming, but the way that it's delivered, I think, with everything else that the film has kind of like worked for, with its with establishing Clark as a more emotional and vulnerable superhero, it makes sense. It's actually a surprisingly rather tearful monologue with the way that Pa Kent delivers it here. That doesn't just feel like this kind of like stern, proud moment, but like this sensation of just like revealing yourself as being concerned and almost scared of wanting to put yourself out there, but making sure that you do it anyway. And I think that the same goes for like how James Gunn made this Superman film. I think that this film, like, it's not afraid to go certain places. It's not afraid to be bold with establishing Superman. It's not afraid to be political, and it's definitely not afraid to make, some of the obvious jokes that you would make about some of these superheroes, like, with like, I mean, because I do love Superman, and I love that, Gunn still has an earnestness and a heart to the character. It makes him kind and wonderful, but can still, address the fact that this guy is wearing red underwear on the outside. And not to mention, Guy Gardner has a ridiculous haircut. You have to admit that. So Gunn doesn't shy away from that as well. He basically does the stuff that I love with Justice League Unlimited, which is, plop you into this universe with, stay true to the comics, but also be a little bit more open about the ridiculousness of these types of characters, which does not demean the film. I think for a lot of people, they'll think, oh, it's just going to be too jokey. They're not going to take anything seriously here. It's like, no, they do, but you do need jokes, and you need some levity so that you can care about these characters instead of just being like an onslaught of the dark and the serious. Because if it's all dark all the time, it becomes really hard to care about these characters who are so serious with all this. And that was like a big problem with Zack Snyder's films of like Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. It's like they took themselves so seriously that they never took a moment to like step back and recognize the ridiculousness of the situation to basically make it seem more human. Because I mean like the way that like Snyder's films kind of felt like it felt like it was more about like a battle of man versus God. And with Gunn's film, I think, I don't think it's so easy to like nail down. Like I said, there's nature versus nurture, which does play a big role in the film. But then there's also brain versus brawn, which plays a role in the big climactic fight here. But I do like the fact how, because it feels like some people try to argue for like the Snyderverse films. It's like, oh well, with all the other Superman films, it was Superman versus Lex Luthor, so it was brain versus brawn, brain versus brawn. Why can't we have brawn versus brawn? And I love the fact that this film, within its script, it does find a way to counter that by saying like, it's not just about brain versus brawn. There's way more to it than that. So yeah, there's a lot of the themes explored here, and like I said, some of it does get minimized, but for the most part, I think the stuff that matters, James Gunn focuses on the most and makes you care about it. Even just like nothing stuff, like at Superman's Fortress of Solitude, he's got all these robots, and like the lead robot, voiced by Alan Tudyk, is called Number 4. Even he has his moments of charm, and I just thought there's going to be nothing to that scene. It's just going to be Superman has to go to this fortress, he has to repair himself and get back into the battle. It's like, no, you can use these moments to have more fun dialogue and like define these characters more instead of just dulling out exposition in order to get to the next scene. And James Gunn has done that fairly well in stuff with like Guardians of the Galaxy, and he does it well here as well. He makes a very bright, colorful, endearing, and most importantly, an honest Superman film. It really felt like, because I think one of the inspirations for James Gunn wanting to make this film was just the connection that he had with his dad, and wanting to bring some of that out in this material. And I really think he does make that clear here. It feels like a much more personal story to that degree, while still also just having fun with Superman and all the other, little DC Comics hallmarks here. So it packs a lot into this film, and you really do have to keep up with it. It's pretty like quick with how it darts between Superman being drawn into a geopolitical conflict, and Lex Luthor's evil schemes that get revealed, and all the other superpowered superheroes that get revealed in this. There's a lot that's packed into it, but the fact that it's able to keep up with like a lot of its themes and tones, and just be fun. I think that is the key factor. I think, like I said, there's a lot of weighty themes here, but for the most part, it's just a fun superhero film, and it brings out the best stuff that I love about Superman. Like, there's a lot of Superman comics that I read, and my favorite ones are the ones where you see Superman showing some of that kindness, but also showing him, becoming more engaged with our world, instead of just being, like the typical superhero who just like saves a cat and then punches out the giant monster and that's it. No, here they show that Superman has a mind and thoughts and beliefs, and that they're not all perfect, and that they have to, that he has to work on this stuff and has to be better in a world that is constantly trying to define him. And that's what makes him such a more interesting character, I think, than how everyone else simplifies him to being just, you know, this superpowered dude in red underwear who can punch people really hard. I mean, that kind of seems what we got in the Snyderverse films, but it's not what we got in the James Gunn films. So yeah, for being that just that bright and colorful and just overflowing with warmth. I mean, this is the Superman I love. This is the Superman from, you know, comics like All-Star Superman and Superman Smashes the Klan that I love so much. And I could not be more happy with the fact that James Gunn has tried to, you know, bring out that side of the character in just a big, exciting and fun, colorful film like this. So yeah, I absolutely adore James Gunn's Superman film.